A 22-year-old American climbs out of the ground into the cold. He has spent the night underground, in a meat locker beneath a slaughterhouse, while the city above him burned. Now it is morning and the city is gone. Dresden, a city 12 centuries old, one of the most beautiful in Europe, has been turned into a flat plain of ash and standing chimneys. The streets are still too hot to walk on. The bodies are everywhere, and they don't look like bodies anymore. That young man's name was Kurt Vonnegut, and it would take him 23 years to write down what he saw that morning. This is not a book review. This is the story of how a man tried and failed and tried again for 2 decades to put one unspeakable thing into words, and how, when he finally did, he had to invent aliens and time travel to do it. Because the truth could not be told in a straight line. The numbers are the easy part. On the night of February 13th, 1945, British and American bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives and incendiaries on Dresden. The high explosives blew the roofs off. The incendiaries set the interiors alight. And then the fires merged into a single mass, a firestorm, a self-feeding column of flames so hot it generated its own hurricane-force winds, pulling in air, pulling in oxygen, pulling in people. Vonnegut was there as a prisoner of war. He'd been captured at the Battle of the Bulge weeks earlier, marched across Germany, and packed into Dresden with other American POWs. Their barracks was a converted slaughterhouse. The Germans had a number for it. In German, it was Schlachthof. Slaughterhouse 5. When the bombing started, the prisoners and their guards were herded down into an underground meat locker, a cellar built to keep animal carcasses cold, 2 stories below the street. The thick stone and the cold air saved them. Above them, the city they could not see was becoming a furnace. The temperature on the surface climbed high enough to melt glass and ignite asphalt. When they finally came up the next day, their job was to dig the dead out of the cellars where they had suffocated. Vonnegut later called it a corpse mine. That cellar, Slaughterhouse 5, is the only reason Kurt Vonnegut lived to write anything at all. But surviving was just the beginning of the problem. Here is the first thing most people don't know. Vonnegut did not come home and write a war novel. He came home and tried to, and for 23 years, he could not. He had the most important story of his generation sitting inside him. He'd seen something almost no other American writer had witnessed firsthand. And every time he sat down to write it, it came out wrong. Flat. Small. He filled wastebaskets. He told friends the book was finished, then admitted it wasn't, then started over. The problem was structural, and it was honest. A war story has a shape. It has heroes and villains, a beginning and a climax and a meaning. But Dresden had no meaning. There was no lesson in it, no redemption, no point at which the suffering paid off into something noble. It was just a city, and then it was just ash. How do you give a narrative arc to something that is, at its core, a void? For 23 years, the most truthful thing Vonnegut could say about Dresden was nothing. So, what finally broke the silence? What broke it was the decision to stop pretending the story made sense. The book Vonnegut finally published in 1969 follows a man named Billy Pilgrim. And Billy, in the very first pages, becomes unstuck in time. He doesn't experience his life from beginning to end. He bounces childhood, war, old age, his own death, all out of order, with no warning, no control. One moment he's a prisoner in Dresden. The next he's an optometrist in 1960s America. The next he's been kidnapped by aliens. Readers have spent decades arguing about whether the aliens are real or whether Billy is simply broken, whether the time travel is science fiction or the symptom of a mind that survived something it could not hold. And that argument is the whole point. Because this is what trauma actually does. It refuses chronology. A survivor doesn't remember the worst night of his life in order, like a story. He gets ambushed by it, a smell, a sound, and suddenly he is back there, fully, with no transition. Billy Pilgrim's Unstuck in Time is not a gimmick. It is the most accurate description of post-traumatic memory ever put into fiction. Vonnegut couldn't write the trauma in a straight line because trauma does not happen in a straight line. The aliens, the time jumps, the flying saucers, they aren't decoration. They are the only containers strong enough to hold a thing that has no narrative shape. But there's one more layer most readers walk right past. The aliens give Billy a philosophy. They're called the Tralfamadorians, and they see all of time at once, past, present, and future, all equally real, all unchangeable. When someone dies, they simply say, "So it goes." And in the book, every single death, a war, a glass of flat champagne, millions of people, gets the same 3 words. So it goes. It sounds like comfort. It sounds like peace. Make your peace, accept that everything already happened, you can't change it anyway. And here is the trap. That philosophy is not Vonnegut's answer. It is the lie that lets you survive, and the lie he is warning you against. So it goes is what you tell yourself so you can keep breathing while a city burns. It is the surrender of a man who has decided that resistance is pointless because the slaughter is already woven into time. Vonnegut hands you that comfort precisely so you can feel how poisonous it is. A book that truly believed So It Goes would not have needed 23 years to write. He wrote it because he refused to accept it. That tension between numbness and grief, between accepting horror and screaming at it, is the engine of the entire novel. And it's exactly why, decades later, people tried to ban it. This is the third thing most people don't know, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Slaughterhouse 5 became one of the most frequently banned and challenged books in America. School boards pulled it off shelves. In 1973, a school in North Dakota didn't just remove copies, it burned them in the school furnace. The objections were always the same: the language, the sex, the irreverence, the refusal to treat war as glorious. In 1975, a school board on Long Island, New York, ordered Slaughterhouse 5 and several other titles removed from school libraries, calling them anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy. A group of students sued. The case, Island Trees School District versus Pico, climbed all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1982, the court ruled, in a landmark decision, that school officials cannot remove books from library shelves simply because they dislike the ideas inside them. A student's right to receive information was held to be protected by the First Amendment. Think about that. A book born in an underground meat locker, written to describe a massacre, became the legal battleground for whether American students have the constitutional right to read challenging ideas at all. The firestorm that Vonnegut survived in 1945 was still throwing off heat in an American courtroom 37 years later. But to understand why it terrified people so much, you have to understand what the book was really arguing. Vonnegut was not anti-war in the simple, sloganeering sense. He knew that telling people not to have wars was, in his own words, about as useful as telling them not to have glaciers. His target was narrower and sharper. It was the story we tell about war, the clean, heroic, meaningful version. The version with a moral. Vonnegut had stood in the actual ash of the actual city, and he knew that version was a lie. So he gave his book a subtitle almost nobody remembers: The Children's Crusade. Because the soldiers weren't grizzled heroes. They were boys. Children, sent to die and to kill, dressed up afterward by survivors and politicians as something grand. That is the real radicalism of Slaughterhouse 5. It refuses to let the massacre mean something. It refuses to convert dead children into a noble sacrifice. And a culture that needs its wars to be noble finds that refusal unbearable, unbearable enough to pull the book from shelves, unbearable enough to feed it into a furnace. Vonnegut took the most chaotic, formless, unspeakable experience a human being can have, and instead of forcing it into a comforting shape, he built a book honest enough to stay broken. That is why it survived. That is why it's still banned. And that is why, more than 50 years later, it still works. If this changed how you think about Slaughterhouse 5, or about what a book is even capable of carrying, subscribe right now. Every week we break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time, the way you were never taught in school. And if these 10 minutes were worth your time, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this story deserves to be heard, and it helps this channel more than you'd think. So it goes. But this story, we're not letting disappear. In a London courtroom in 1895, a prosecutor stood up, opened a novel, and began reading it aloud to a jury line by line, as evidence that its author was a criminal. The book was fiction. The author was sitting a few feet away. And before the trials were over, the words he had invented would help send him to prison and destroy him. The author was Oscar Wilde. The novel was the picture of Dorian Gray. It was the only novel he ever wrote. This is not a summary of that book. This is an argument about what Wilde was actually warning us about, and why, more than a century later, his warning reads less like Victorian melodrama and more like a description of the world you scrolled through this morning. Here is what everyone thinks they know. A beautiful young man wishes that a portrait of himself would age and decay in his place, so that he could stay young and flawless forever. The wish comes true. He stays perfect. The painting, hidden in an attic, absorbs every sin, every cruelty, every year, growing more hideous as the man stays untouched. It sounds like a horror story about vanity. A morality tale. Don't be too obsessed with your own face. But that reading misses what Wilde was really circling. Because Dorian's tragedy is not that he loves his own beauty. It's that he discovers he can be one thing in public and another thing entirely in private, and that the public version is the only one anyone will ever judge him by. Watch how it happens in the book. Dorian is corrupted not by a mirror, but by a man, Lord Henry Wotton, a glittering, poisonous aristocrat who fills his head with a single seductive idea, that the only things worth living for are youth and beauty, and that to deny yourself any pleasure is a kind of cowardice. Lord Henry never lifts a finger to harm anyone. He just talks. He hands Dorian a philosophy and then watches, amused, as the young man builds his entire life around it. And the face stays innocent. The truth gets locked in a room nobody sees. Now hold that thought. Because there's a reason Wilde understood that split so intimately, and it has everything to do with the second life he was living while he wrote it. To understand the warning, you have to understand the censorship, because the version most people read was already softened before it ever reached them. Wilde wrote Dorian Gray first as a long story for an American magazine, Lippincott's, in 1890. And the magazine's editor, before printing it, quietly cut roughly 500 words out of it. He didn't ask. He didn't tell Wilde. He just deleted the passages he found too dangerous, most of them lines that made the love between the painter, Basil Hallward, and Dorian unmistakably romantic, even erotic. Then the British press attacked it anyway. Reviewers called it poisonous, unclean, a book for outlawed noblemen and perverted telegraph boys. One paper said it was fit only to be burned. So when Wilde turned it into the 1891 book, he didn't fight back by restoring what was cut. He retreated further. He added 6 new chapters to make it look more like a respectable novel, and he wrote a now famous preface full of cool, defiant lines. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. That preface was armor. It was Wilde trying to insist, in advance, that art had nothing to do with the morals of the artist. The fully uncensored original, the one Wilde actually wrote, before the editor's knife, wasn't published until 2011. 121 years later. Think about that. For more than a century, the world's most famous version of this novel was a version that had already been edited for danger, twice over, once in secret by a nervous American editor, and once by Wilde himself, flinching from his own critics. Wilde sanded down his own book to survive. And the most chilling part is what that self-censorship foreshadowed about his own life. Because the gap between the public Wilde and the private Wilde was not a metaphor. It was real, and it was dangerous. In Victorian England, sex between men was a crime. The law was called gross indecency, passed in 1885, and it carried up to 2 years of hard labor. Wilde was a married man with 2 sons, a celebrated playwright, the most quoted wit in London. He was also, privately, in love with a young aristocrat named Lord Alfred Douglas. Douglas's father, a violent, raging man called the Marquis of Queensberry, found out and left a card at Wilde's club accusing him, in a misspelled scrawl, of posing as a sodomite. It was a public insult designed to provoke. And Wilde made the catastrophic decision to fight it. He sued Queensberry for libel. To win a libel case, you have to prove the insult was false. So Queensberry's lawyers set out to prove it was true. They hired investigators. They gathered names. And then they reached for the one piece of evidence Wilde had handed them himself years earlier, in print. They reached for his novel. This is the moment the warning becomes literal. In the witness box, Wilde was cross-examined by Queensberry's barrister, Edward Carson, a man who had been Wilde's classmate at Trinity College, Dublin. And Carson did something almost unheard of. He treated a work of fiction as a confession. He read passages from Dorian Gray aloud and demanded Wilde defend them as if they were diary entries. He quoted the painter Basil saying he worshipped Dorian, that he could not be happy unless he saw him every day. "Have you ever adored a young man madly?" Carson asked. He pressed on the deleted, the suggestive, the tender. He tried to collapse the distance between what Wilde wrote and what Wilde was. Wilde fought back with wit, brilliant, quotable, doomed. When Carson sneered at one of his epigrams, Wilde corrected the lawyer's grammar. The gallery laughed. But every laugh was a step closer to the cliff, because Carson wasn't trying to win an argument. He was building a record. Each tender line from the novel, read aloud and left hanging in the air, was a brick in the case that the man who wrote such things must surely live them. The strategy was a trap. The libel case collapsed. And the evidence dragged out in that courtroom didn't just lose Wilde his lawsuit. It handed the state everything it needed. The man who sued to defend his name was about to be arrested in his own. Within hours of losing the libel trial, the authorities used the testimony against him. Wilde was arrested and charged criminally with gross indecency. There were 2 more trials. The first jury couldn't agree. The second convicted him. On the 20th of May, 1895, the judge sentenced Oscar Wilde to 2 years of hard labor and called it, with open contempt, the worst case I have ever tried. He served the full term. He broke stones, walked a treadmill, slept on a plank bed. He emerged bankrupt, his name a slur, his plays pulled from London stages. He fled to France under a false name and died there 3 years later in a cheap hotel room at 46. The book that imagined a man whose hidden self was exposed and punished had, in the end, exposed and punished its author. Wilde wrote the mechanism of his own destruction and then walked straight into it. But here's the part that should stop you. Because the thing Wilde was actually warning about wasn't a Victorian sex law. It was something that didn't fully arrive until our century. Think again about what Dorian Gray actually does. He keeps a flawless public image. He keeps the truth of who he is locked in a private place. He performs perfection for an audience that judges only the surface, and he lets the real record of his choices accumulate, unseen, in a room he never lets anyone enter. Now think about the image you maintain. The filtered photo that smooths your skin, brightens your eyes, sharpens your jaw. The curated feed where every meal is beautiful and every relationship looks effortless. The profile that is younger, thinner, happier, more successful than the person who actually wakes up in your bed. We have all built a portrait of ourselves to show the world, and we keep the real one, the aging and anxious and complicated one, hidden away. Wilde saw the exact psychology of this in 1890, before the camera was in every hand. He understood that when a culture learns to judge a person by a perfected image, the person starts living for the image, and the gap between the surface and the soul becomes the place where everything rots. Dorian's painting is the original filter. It's the unretouched file we are all terrified someone will open. Wilde wasn't warning us about vanity. He was warning us about a world that would reward us for becoming beautiful liars and then quietly destroy us in the room where the truth is kept. That is why his only novel, the one read aloud to convict him, still reads like a prophecy. If this changed how you see the picture of Dorian Gray and the image you put online every day, subscribe right now. Page and Flame breaks down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time, the readings you were never handed in school. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It's the one signal that tells the algorithm a story like this deserves to be seen. Wilde's portrait stayed hidden for too long. Don't let this one. November 1820. 1,100 miles off the coast of South America, the open Pacific, the crew of the whale ship Essex watches an 85-foot sperm whale do something no whale is supposed to do. It stops. It turns. It faces the ship head-on. And then it drives its enormous skull straight into the bow at full speed on purpose. The ship buckles. Water floods in. 20 men are about to be stranded in 3 small boats, thousands of miles from land, and what happens to them in the months that follow is so horrifying that one man will spend the next 30 years afraid to talk about it. That man's account is the seed of the most famous novel in American literature. And here is the part nobody tells you. The whale in Moby Dick was real. 2 of them, actually. Herman Melville did not invent Ahab's white whale. He assembled it out of a true shipwreck and a true sea monster that whalers genuinely feared. This is not a summary of Moby Dick. It's the case that the novel everyone thinks is fiction is built on documented fact, and that the book was such a catastrophic failure that it nearly ended Melville's life before the world ever understood what he'd made. Let's start with the ship. The Essex sailed out of Nantucket in 1819, and Nantucket at that moment was the oil capital of the world. Not petroleum, sperm whale oil, the substance that lit the lamps of America and Europe, that lubricated the machines of the early Industrial Revolution. A single sperm whale's head contained a reservoir of clean, waxy oil called spermaceti, and a full ship could be worth a fortune. Men left Nantucket for years at a time to hunt it. But the easy whaling grounds in the Atlantic were already exhausted by 1819. So the Essex went farther than almost anyone had gone into the remote Pacific, the offshore ground, 1,000 miles from any coast. They were in the most isolated water on Earth when they found a pod of sperm whales. And one of those whales found them. By every account, sperm whales did not attack ships. They fled. Whalers harpooned them from small boats precisely because the animal's instinct was to dive and run, not to fight a vessel. What the Essex met was an animal behaving against its entire species' nature. The first mate, Owen Chase, watched it ram the ship once, swim off, turn, and come back to ram it a second time deliberately, with what he described as tenfold fury and vengeance. That detail, a whale that attacks on purpose, that seems to choose its target, is the detail Melville would build an entire novel around. But to understand why he believed it, you have to know that the Essex wasn't the only ship that had met a whale like this. There was one specific whale that whalers told stories about by name. His name was Moby Dick. In 1839, 11 years before Moby Dick was published, a writer named Jeremiah Reynolds published a magazine article about a real, notorious sperm whale that haunted the waters near Mocha Island, off the coast of Chile. The whalers called him Moby Dick. And 2 things made him legendary. First, he was white. An old bull sperm whale, pale as wool, scarred and barnacled, white as a snowflake, in Reynolds's words. An albino, or close to it, a freak of nature that stood out against the dark sea like a ghost. Second, he fought back. Moby Dick was said to have survived attack after attack, dragging harpoons in his hide like trophies, and to have destroyed dozens of boats and killed the men who hunted him. He wasn't prey. He was an adversary. Whalers genuinely feared crossing his water. A white whale. Famous by name. Hunted obsessively. Striking back at the men who came for him. You can see it, can't you? You can already see Ahab. Melville took the white skin and the vengeful intelligence of Moby Dick, and he fused it with the documented, deliberate ship sinking of the Essex disaster. Moby Dick is the marriage of those 2 true stories. And the proof that Melville knew exactly what he was doing comes from what he did next, because he didn't just read about the Essex. He met its survivors. But first, what actually happened to those survivors? Because it is worse than the novel. When the Essex went down, 20 men piled into 3 small whaleboats with almost no food and barely any water, in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet. The nearest islands were close, but the sailors were terrified those islands held cannibals. So they made a fatal decision. They turned away from land and sailed thousands of miles towards South America instead. It destroyed them. Weeks at sea. The water ran out. The men began to die of thirst and starvation, one by one. And then the survivors did the thing that haunted them forever. They ate the dead. When a man died, the others consumed his body to stay alive. This was, by the grim custom of the sea, almost expected. What came next was not. In one of the boats, the food ran out completely, and no one had died recently enough to eat. So the men drew lots to decide who would be killed so the others could live. The boy who lost was a 17-year-old named Owen Coffin, the captain's own young cousin. He was shot by his shipmates and eaten. The captain, George Pollard, had to allow the killing of his own relative. Of the 20 men who escaped the sinking, only 8 survived. They were found half-mad, clutching the bones of their dead crewmates, unable to let go of them even when rescued. This is the true event underneath Moby Dick. Not a sea adventure, a descent into the absolute edge of human horror. And Melville knew the details, because in 1841 he sailed on a whale ship himself, and at sea he met the son of one of the Essex survivors, who handed him Owen Chase's written narrative of the disaster. Melville later said reading that account, on the very ocean where it happened, had a surprising effect on him. He had the ship. He had the whale. He had the horror. So why did the book fail? Here's the surprise that breaks most people's brains. Moby Dick, published in 1851, was a flop. Not a modest disappointment, a career-ending disaster. The reviews ranged from confused to savage. British critics were baffled by a novel that kept stopping the story to deliver chapters on whale anatomy, on the color white, on the history of whaling, on philosophy and theology. One reviewer called it trash. Readers who wanted a sea adventure got a strange, sprawling, experimental thing that didn't behave like a novel was supposed to behave. It sold poorly. Over Melville's entire lifetime, it earned him a pittance. And it took him down with it. Melville had been a moderately successful author before. His early sea tales sold well. Moby Dick was the moment he reached for greatness, and the public turned away. His career never recovered. His later books sold even worse. Eventually, he gave up writing fiction almost entirely and took a job as a customs inspector on the New York docks, checking cargo for a daily wage, for 19 years. When Herman Melville died in 1891, he was so forgotten that a newspaper obituary misspelled the title of his masterpiece, calling it Moby Dick. The book that we now call the greatest American novel ever written sank, with its author, almost without a trace. So how did it come back? And what makes it worth your time today? It came back by accident, decades later. In the 1920s, around the centennial of Melville's birth, a handful of scholars and writers rediscovered the forgotten customs inspector and actually read the strange whale book he'd left behind. And read with fresh eyes that had survived a world war, eyes used to ambiguity and obsession and broken narratives, Moby Dick suddenly looked less like a failure and more like a prophecy. Because what Melville had built wasn't a flawed adventure story. It was the first truly modern American novel. The very things the Victorians hated, the digressions, the encyclopedia of whaling, the refusal to stay inside one neat plot, turned out to be the point. Ahab's monomaniacal hunt for a creature that had wounded him became a bottomless symbol of obsession, of vengeance, of a man destroying everyone around him in pursuit of something that may not even be evil, only indifferent. The white whale could be God, or nature, or fate, or nothing at all, and Melville built it precisely so it could be all of those at once. That's the argument worth holding on to. Moby Dick endures not because it's a thrilling tale of a whale hunt, but because Melville took two true stories, a real ship sunk by a real whale, and a real white monster the whalers feared by name, and used them to ask a question that has no answer. When something hurts you and you can't understand why, do you accept it, or do you chase it to the bottom of the sea and drag your whole world down with you? The Essex crew met that question by accident. Ahab chose it. And Melville spent a failed life writing it down, for readers who wouldn't exist until he was decades in the grave. If this changed how you see Moby Dick, subscribe, because here at Page and Flame, We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time, and we go after the true story underneath the fiction. New video every week. And if these 10 minutes were worth your time, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it's the single strongest signal that tells the algorithm a story like this deserves to surface. Don't let it sink. A small steamboat crawls up a fog-bound river, deep in a continent it does not understand. The men aboard cannot see 10 feet ahead. Out in the white nothing, a drum is beating. Then the fog lifts, and they realize the riverbanks are lined with people they were never meant to find, moving towards something at the end of the water that no sane man should want to reach. That scene is the spine of 2 stories. One is a novella published in 1899, written by a Polish sailor who taught himself English as an adult. The other is the most expensive, most disastrous, most legendary war film ever made. They are the same story. And almost nobody who quotes Apocalypse Now has read the book it was stolen from. Here is the argument I want to make. Heart of Darkness is not about the jungle. It is not about savagery. The horror Conrad was writing about was not out there in the trees, it was sitting in an office in Brussels, wearing a clean suit, signing paperwork. And once you see that, you cannot watch Apocalypse Now the same way again. Start with the man who wrote it, because his story is stranger than the fiction. Joseph Conrad was not really named Joseph Conrad. He was born Józef Korzeniowski's, in what is now Ukraine, to Polish parents the Russian Empire treated as enemies. He went to sea at 16. English was his 3rd language, learned in his 20s from sailors and dock workers. He would become one of the greatest stylists the language has ever produced, and he never lost his accent. In 1890, Conrad did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He took a job as a steamboat captain for a Belgian trading company, working the Congo River. He went up that river himself. What he saw there nearly killed him, physically and morally, and a decade later, he turned it into a book. So when you read Heart of Darkness, you are not reading invention. You are reading a witness statement. That changes everything that follows. But what exactly did he witness? That is where the real horror begins. In the 1880s, King Leopold II of Belgium did something no king had ever done. He acquired a colony, not for his country, but personally. For himself. A private estate the size of Western Europe, which he called, with breathtaking nerve, the Congo Free State. It was free for exactly 1 person. Leopold never set foot in the Congo. He ran it from palaces in Belgium, as a business, extracting first ivory and then rubber. To hit the rubber quotas, his agents used a system of terror so precise it has its own grim statistics. Villages that failed their quotas were burned. Hostages were taken. And to prove they had not wasted bullets, soldiers were required to bring back a severed human hand for every cartridge they fired. Baskets of hands. That was the accounting system of a European monarch in the lifetime of people's grandparents. Historians estimate that under Leopold's rule, the population of the Congo fell by roughly 10 million people. Conrad was there. He saw the chained work gangs. He saw men left to die in what he called the Grove of Death. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. The book softened it. The reality was worse than the novella. And Leopold sold the whole thing as charity. He called himself a humanitarian. He hosted geographic societies and anti-slavery conferences in Brussels, while his agents ran the most efficient extraction machine the continent had ever seen. The public relations operation was as advanced as the cruelty. He hired journalists, paid off critics, and printed his own version of events, so that for years, the people of Europe genuinely believed their king was a saint civilizing the dark continent, while the baskets of hands piled up out of frame. That is the lie Conrad came home carrying. Not the lie of the jungle. The lie of the office. So why does everyone think Heart of Darkness is about the jungle being dark? Because of one word, repeated and almost universally misread. Darkness. Read carelessly. The title sounds like it's pointing at Africa, at the wilderness, at the people Conrad's narrator meets. That is the racist reading, and the novelist Chinua Achebe famously attacked the book for it. It's a fair fight and worth having. But look at where Conrad actually puts the darkness. The book does not open in Africa. It opens on a boat on the River Thames in London, the heart of the largest empire on Earth. And the narrator's first real observation is this, and this also has been one of the dark places of the Earth. He's pointing at England, at Europe, at civilization itself. The darkness in the title is not the jungle. It is what supposedly civilized men do when they get far enough from anyone who might judge them, when the only law is the quota and the only god is the balance sheet. The horror travels into the Congo wearing a starched collar. It is bureaucratic. It is economic. It is us. Hold that thought, because now a film director is about to pick up this exact idea and aim it at a different war. In 1976, Francis Ford Coppola flew to the Philippines to make a Vietnam War movie based, loosely, on Conrad's novella. He thought it would take a few months. It took over a year, and it nearly destroyed him. A typhoon flattened the sets. The Philippine military kept recalling the helicopters he'd rented for combat scenes to go fight an actual insurgency. His leading man, Martin Sheen, had a heart attack at 36 and had to crawl to a road for help. And Marlon Brando arrived to play the central role, grossly overweight, having never read the book, having barely read the script, so Coppola shot him mostly in shadow and let him improvise. Coppola later stood up at the Cannes Film Festival and said something extraordinary. He said, "My film is not about Vietnam. My film is Vietnam." The production had become the thing it was about. A well-resourced operation marching upriver into chaos, hemorrhaging money and sanity, unable to turn back. He didn't just adapt Conrad's plot. He reenacted Conrad's argument with his own life. There's a detail from the shoot that makes this almost unbearable to think about. The crew flew in real corpses for a scene, bodies a local supplier claimed he could provide, until it emerged the supplier may have been a grave robber, and the production realized it had no idea where the dead had come from. A film about men losing the line between civilization and atrocity had, in the making, walked right up to that line itself. The mirror Conrad built had started reflecting again, 80 years later, on the other side of the world. Look at how exact the mirroring is, because this is the part film students miss. Conrad's narrator, Marlowe, travels upriver to find a company agent named Kurtz, a man who arrived full of high ideals about civilizing the natives, and who instead set himself up as a god, surrounded by violence. His outpost ringed with severed heads on stakes. Kurtz is what the system produces when you strip away the paperwork and let a man act on what the quotas were always really asking for. Coppola keeps the name, Colonel Kurtz. He keeps the journey upriver. He keeps the idealist who went mad at the end of the line, the heads on stakes, the company man sent to find him. He even keeps Kurtz's dying words, the horror. The horror. But here's the move that proves Coppola understood the book better than his critics did. In the film, Kurtz isn't insane because the jungle drove him mad. He's the one man who looked clearly at what the war actually was: the bombing, the body counts, the lies briefed in air-conditioned rooms, and stopped pretending it was civilization. The official, polite, bureaucratic war is the madness. Kurtz is just the man who said so out loud. That is Conrad's thesis, transplanted whole. The horror was never in the wilderness. It was in the office that sent you there. So what do we do with this, now more than a century after Conrad and half a century after Coppola? We stop letting the story comfort us. The easy reading, savage jungle, civilized men, things fall apart out there, is the version that lets everyone at home off the hook. Conrad refused that. He had seen the clean men in Brussels who never raised a hand and signed off on the baskets of hands anyway. He knew the most dangerous person in the whole machine is the one who keeps his cuffs spotless. Heart of Darkness endures because it names a permanent fact about power, that the worst things are rarely done by monsters in the dark. They are done by ordinary employees, hitting their numbers, far enough up the river that no one is watching. Leopold did it with rubber. Kurtz did it with ivory. And every reader, in every generation, is invited to ask which quota they're currently helping to fill. Conrad didn't write a horror story about Africa. He wrote a mirror and pointed it at the people holding the book. If this changed how you read Heart of Darkness, or how you watch Apocalypse Now, subscribe right now. Every week, we go up the river into the books that built the world, and we pull out the argument you were never handed in school. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit that like button. It's the single clearest signal that this kind of story deserves to be seen. Don't let it disappear into the fog. A storm is breaking over Lake Geneva, and inside a rented villa 5 people are trapped indoors, daring each other to write a ghost story. 4 of them are adults. The 5th is an 18-year-old girl who has just buried a baby and run away from home. That night, she cannot sleep. With her eyes shut, she sees a pale student kneeling beside the thing he has assembled, and she watches it open one yellow, watery eye. By morning, she has the opening of a novel that will outlive every famous man in the room. Her name is Mary Godwin. She is not yet married. She is not yet 20. And she is about to invent science fiction. Here is the part the culture got wrong, and has kept getting wrong for 200 years. When you say the word Frankenstein, you're almost certainly picturing the monster, flat head, neck bolts, lumbering arms. But Frankenstein is not the monster. Frankenstein is the man who made him and then ran. The creature has no name at all. And that confusion, naming the abandoned child after the father who abandoned him, is not a trivia mistake. It is the exact wound at the center of the book. We will come back to that, because it changes everything. But first, the claim that sounds like exaggeration and isn't. A teenager effectively invented an entire literary genre. Let's be precise about what science fiction actually is, because people confuse it with stories about the future or stories with gadgets. It isn't. The historian Brian Aldiss, who wrote one of the foundational histories of the genre, argued that science fiction is something narrower and stranger, fiction in which the engine of the horror or the wonder is not magic, not a god, not a curse, but a man using the science of his own era to do something he should not. By that definition, Frankenstein is the first one. There is no spell. There is no demon. There is a brilliant student, a laboratory, and a method. Victor doesn't summon his creature. He builds it. That single shift, from the supernatural to the procedural, is the birth of the genre. And it could only have happened in that exact year, to a mind soaked in that exact moment. Which is the next thing nobody tells you. The science in Frankenstein was not invented by Mary Shelley. It was ripped straight from the most shocking experiments of her lifetime. In the years before she wrote, European audiences were paying to watch a procedure called galvanism, named after Luigi Galvani, who had made dead frog legs twitch by running electrical current through them. His nephew, Giovanni Aldini, took it further, and in 1803, he did it in public, on the corpse of an executed murderer named George Forster, in London. Aldini attached the wires to the dead man's face and spine, sent the charge through, and the corpse's jaw began to quiver. One eye snapped open, the muscles of the face writhed into a grimace, and a fist clenched and rose into the air. The official report of the event noted that to some of the bystanders it seemed as if the wretched man were on the point of being restored to life. One of the surgeons present was reportedly so shaken he died of fright not long after. Onlookers genuinely believed they were watching a corpse being dragged back from death by nothing but a machine and a wire. Mary Shelley grew up in the shadow of that spectacle. When she describes Victor giving a spark of being to lifeless matter, she is not fantasizing. She is reporting the cutting edge of 1816 science and asking the question the scientists weren't, and then what? That question, and then what, is the one the whole genre would inherit. But to ask it that early, she had to be a very particular kind of teenager. Mary was not a random girl at a party. She was, by birth, one of the most intellectually radioactive people in Europe. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote the founding text of modern feminism and then died 11 days after giving birth to her. Her father was William Godwin, a famous radical philosopher. Mary grew up reading her dead mother's books and reportedly learned to read in part by tracing the letters on her mother's gravestone in a London churchyard. Think about that image, a child taught to read on the stone marking the woman who died bringing her into the world. A creator who dies the moment her creation begins. She had been living inside the central metaphor of Frankenstein since before she could spell it. And that is why the book is not really about a monster. It is about what you owe to the thing you bring into existence. Read what actually happens, not the movie. Victor Frankenstein spends years obsessed, building a living being. He succeeds. And the instant it breathes, the instant it works, he is horrified by it and flees the room. He abandons it. The creature is not born evil. It is born alone. It teaches itself to speak by hiding outside a cottage and listening. It reads books it finds in the woods. It approaches people gently, and they beat it and drive it off, again and again, purely because of how it looks. Only after every door is slammed, after its own maker recoils in disgust, does it turn to violence. The horror of Frankenstein is not that the monster exists. The horror is that a creator walked away from his creation, and then blamed the creation for what abandonment made it. Now hold that up against the thing we still do today. Because here is the third fact that should stop you. The full title of the book is Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. Prometheus was the figure from Greek myth who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, and was punished forever for it. Mary Shelley chose that subtitle deliberately. Her warning was never, don't build things. Fire is good. Knowledge is good. Her warning was about what you do after you've lit the flame. Do you stay? Do you take responsibility for the consequences of what you've made? Or do you do what Victor does, create something powerful, recoil from it, and refuse to be accountable for what it becomes? If that sounds uncomfortably modern, that's the point. We are right now building systems and creatures of our own, artificial minds, synthetic life, technologies we switch on without quite knowing what they'll grow into. And the dominant instinct, over and over, is exactly Victor's instinct. Build the thing, marvel at the spark, then disclaim responsibility when it does something we don't like. A 19-year-old diagnosed that reflex in 1818, and we have not outgrown it. So when people sneer that Frankenstein is just a horror story, they have it precisely backwards. It is the most disciplined moral thought experiment of its century, written by the youngest author of any of them. And let's sit with how young, because the publishing world certainly didn't want to. When Frankenstein first appeared in 1818, it was published anonymously. It carried a preface by her husband, the poet Percy Shelley, and many readers and reviewers simply assumed he had written the whole novel. A book this philosophical, this ambitious, this controlled? Surely the work of an established male poet, not a young woman barely out of her teens. Some critics, on learning a woman might be behind it, called it unnatural and disgusting. It took years, and a second edition in 1831 with her name finally on it, for the world to accept the truth. The most influential debut of the era, the seed of an entire genre, was conceived by a teenage girl on a rainy holiday. There's a final detail that makes the whole thing almost unbearable. Remember her mother dying days after childbirth. Remember Mary herself, who by the time she finished the book had already lost her first baby, a premature daughter who lived only days. She once wrote in her journal of a dream that the baby had come back to life if only she could warm it by the fire. A dead child, warmth, and the desperate wish to reanimate what death had taken. That is not a coincidence with her novel. That is its furnace. Frankenstein is not a story about a scientist. It is a grieving girl's reckoning with creation, loss, and the terrible responsibility of bringing life into a world that may not want it. So the next time someone points at the green flat-headed monster and calls it Frankenstein, you'll know two things they don't. You'll know they've named the child after the man who abandoned him. And you'll know that the real monster of the story was never the creature stitched together in the lab. It was the gifted man who made a living thing and then refused to love it, refused to stay, refused to answer for what he'd done. A teenager saw all of that, 2 centuries before we built machines that force us to ask the same question. If this changed how you see Frankenstein, subscribe. Here we break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time, and there are dozens more waiting to be cracked open. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like right now. It's the single signal that tells the algorithm a story like this deserves to be heard. Don't let it get abandoned.